We have talked about the elements that are necessary for a contract to exist, but even though a contract exists because those four elements are present, there still may be the possibility that the contract might not be enforced by a court. And that's because there can be issues with the first element of the contract, the agreement. Remember that the agreement consists of an offer and the acceptance of that offer. The person making the offeror, communicates the offer to the person to whom the offer is being made, the offeree, and the offeree communicates their acceptance of the offer to the offeror. But that offer and the acceptance of that offer must be real. They must be genuine. And the agreement that results from the offer and the acceptance of the offer has to be genuine. It has to be real. It can't be the result of a mistake or because someone misrepresented something about the contract or because someone was forced to enter into the contract. Sometimes the idea that the assent to the contract must be genuine is expressed as the parties to the contract have to have a meeting of the mind. They both have to voluntarily be talking about the same thing. The assent to the contract has to be genuine, and the issues involving the assent to the contract often arise in one of three different situations. That there's been a mistake in making the contract, that someone has said something that is misleading about the contract, or that someone has been forced into making the contract they didn't want to make. In the case of mistake, how a mistake will affect the validity of the contract and whether or not a court will enforce it depends on who made the mistake and the circumstances of the mistake. The general rule that courts go by in dealing with contracts is that people who make contracts are expected to understand the terms of the contract they are making and the obligations and benefits that are involved in their participation in the contract. And so courts generally think that if one party to a contract has made a mistake, if there's been a unilateral mistake made, then that person is not entitled to relief in the court, and the court will enforce the contract. The idea being that if you're going to enter into a contract, you have an obligation to understand what the contract is about, and if you've made a mistake in that, then you haven't upheld your obligation in entering into the contract. Of course, there are exceptions to that. So if the party to the contract who has not made a mistake realizes that the other party to the contract has made a mistake, and the party not making the mistake doesn't alert the other party to the mistake they're making, a court may look at that and say, well, the party who wasn't making a mistake was trying to take advantage of the other party, and we're not going to enforce the contract. If the mistake that's being made by one party, a unilateral mistake, is such that it changes the purpose of the contract, or it makes the contract so unfair that a court thinks that it's an unconscionable contract, the court may decide that it will not enforce the contract because it's not fair. If there's been a mutual mistake, if both parties to the contract have made a mistake about something that's material to the contract, that's important to the contract, well, there really has been no meeting of the minds in that situation, and typically a court will not enforce the contract that both parties have been mistaken about. In negotiating a contract, there's often an exchange of information about the contract by both parties. If one of the parties to the contract provides inaccurate information about what the contract is about or something that's important to the contract, that misrepresentation may be enough for the court to say, well, because of the misrepresentation, there has been no genuine assent. There's been no meeting of the minds of the parties to the contract. But it depends on the intent of the person who made the inaccurate statement. If the misrepresentation, the inaccurate statement, is considered to be innocent, if the person who made the inaccurate statement made the statement believing it to be true, not having any reason to disbelieve it, then that's an innocent misrepresentation. There was no intent by the person who made the inaccurate statement to mislead the other party, and a court typically will not invalidate a contract because of an innocent misrepresentation. On the other hand, if the misrepresentation is considered to be negligent, if the person who made the inaccurate statement made it without any regard to whether it was true or not, or if the person who made the inaccurate statement was in a position so that the other party to the contract could have reasonably assumed that the person making the inaccurate comment or inaccurate statement knew what they were talking about, then even though negligence does not involve intent, in a case like that, if the inaccurate statement is material and pretty clearly led the other party to enter into the contract, then the court will likely, or can, but more than likely will, determine that the inaccurate statement was a negligent misrepresentation and not enforce that contract. Now, in the worst case situation where the inaccurate statement is considered to be fraudulent, that is, the person who made the inaccurate statement made it knowing that the statement was inaccurate and made the inaccurate statement intending to entice the other person, the other party to the contract, to enter into a contract they wouldn't have entered into if they'd known the accurate information, then the court will not enforce that contract because there's been no meeting of the mind. There was an intentional misleading of the other party. The third situation where there may be a problem with assent to a contract is when a person who enters into the contract because they're forced to enter into the contract. And that usually occurs in one of two situations called undue influence or duress, or the other situation, duress. Undue influence occurs when someone who has a special relationship of trust and confidence with another person takes advantage of that special circumstance or that special relationship and entices the person who depends on them for advice to enter into a contract the person might not have otherwise entered into. The court will set aside or not enforce that contract. The idea being that a person took advantage of their position of trust to persuade someone else to do something they wouldn't have otherwise done. Duress is not as subtle as undue influence because duress is actually threatening someone and through that threat forcing them to enter into a contract. That threat can be of physical harm or it can be a threat of economic damage. So if someone threatens to kill me unless I sign this contract, that's duress. That contract can be set aside. If someone threatens to do some sort of economic harm to me, and I believe they can do it and would do it, and I enter into a contract, that also is duress. And there is no genuine assent. There is no meeting of the mind. In those cases, I haven't agreed to the contract, I have entered into the contract because I was threatened with the use of physical or economic force.